This is the brief on Operation Mincemeat. So how exactly do you plant a lie so massive that it literally tricks an entire empire? Well, drawing from the corpse that fooled the Third Reich, we're looking at 1943, when the Allies desperately needed Hitler to believe they were attacking Greece and Sardinia instead of their real target, Sicily. You see, since a living spy could just break under torture, they needed a messenger who literally couldn't talk. It's basically the ultimate high-stakes poker game, bluffing with a hand you don't even have. First, for this unlikely messenger, the Allies actually used a dead man, carrying a briefcase full of fake invasion plans. Think of it like a kind of morbid twist on the Trojan horse. Instead of some giant wooden statue, it's just a single corpse washing ashore. Second, to build a meticulous backstory, they knew they couldn't just drop a body in the ocean, so they completely invented a life for him, complete with a fake name and even a fake girlfriend. Because really, what makes a lie believable? It isn't just the forged military documents in the briefcase. It's that mundane little detail of a girlfriend's photo in a wallet that absolutely sells the illusion. Finally, this resulted in the greatest deception in the history of warfare, because the plot, dubbed Operation Mincemeat, actually worked and successfully tricked Hitler into moving his troops. We always say the truth is going to set you free, right? But what if a perfectly constructed lie is what actually wins a war? Operation Mincemeat proves that sometimes the most absurd, meticulously crafted fictions are exactly what it takes to completely alter the course of real-world history.
This map of North Africa and Southern Europe shows the strategic bottleneck of July 1943. The Allies have secured North Africa, and they need a stepping stone into Italy. Look at the distance. Sicily is sitting right there, a narrow 100-mile gap from Allied bases. The physics of 1940s warfare severely limited their options. Fighter planes carry a finite amount of fuel, and slow-moving invasion ships require constant protection from the air. Expanding the combat radius from those North African bases, you can see that Allied air cover easily reaches Sicily. Sardinia and Greece, however, sit well outside that safety zone. German intelligence officers possessed the exact same maps and the exact same fuel metrics. They knew an attack was coming, and they immediately began fortifying the island with troops, tanks, and artillery, ready to meet the Allied forces on the beaches. The Allies found themselves stuck in a lethal geographic trap. Attacking an island the enemy is actively preparing to defend guarantees immense losses. Military planners estimated the cost of taking Sicily by brute force could reach hundreds of thousands of lives. This brought a small British intelligence group known as the 20 Committee face-to-face with a massive logistical problem. They could not physically move Sicily, and they could not hide an invasion fleet. They had to somehow trick the German High Command into moving their defenses to a different, less logical target. You cannot simply broadcast a false location or let a careless denial slip. A suspicious enemy will scrutinize every detail. For high-stakes disinformation to work, the enemy must feel like they are uncovering a tightly guarded secret completely on their own. Sending a living double agent to hand over fake invasion plans carries enormous risk. Under interrogation, the human body betrays itself. A spy can get nervous, stumble over a specific date, or break down completely under the intense pressure of a Gestapo interview. To survive the scrutiny of German intelligence, the British needed a messenger completely immune to fear. They needed an operative who could not sweat, could not crack, and could not be interrogated. They needed a dead body. A few months prior, a long list of deception tactics called the Trout Memo had circulated through British intelligence. Most of the suggestions were discarded, but buried far down the page was Idea 28. Take a corpse, dress it in a military uniform, plant false secret documents in its pockets, and let the enemy find it. Two intelligence officers, Charles Cholmondeley and Ewan Montague, pulled this bizarre concept off the shelf. Their assignment was to figure out if dropping a dead man into the Mediterranean could actually work in practice. The immediate hurdle was forensic science. When the Germans recovered the body, their military doctors would inevitably perform an autopsy. A skilled pathologist can easily read the true cause of death in human tissue. For the deception to hold up, the corpse had to present specific biological markers of dying at sea, like fluid in the lungs from drowning or the physiological signs of extreme exposure from a plane crash. Cholmondeley and Montague realized that carefully forged documents were entirely useless if the body carrying them told the wrong medical story. The biological reality of the messenger had to flawlessly match the fiction. Once they established the medical requirements, they faced an equally difficult social test. The body had to belong to someone who would simply vanish without a trace. If the intelligence service used the body of an ordinary citizen and a grieving family filed a missing persons report in London, German spies operating in Britain might notice the discrepancy. A single police inquiry could unravel the entire operation. Their quiet search through London's mortuaries eventually led them to Glyndwr Michael. He was a homeless Welshman in his early 30s, living in extreme poverty. He had died slowly in a hospital after ingesting rat poison, and no one came to claim his remains. In the cold calculus of military planning, Michael's tragic end was remarkably useful. The chemical effects of the poison closely mimicked the physical shock and exposure of a crash at sea. More importantly, his total isolation meant there would be no family asking questions and no police looking for answers. Glyndwr Michael was nearly invisible to the society he lived in. That absolute lack of connection gave the British military the perfect, untraceable blank slate they needed for the mission. Now, Cholmondeley and Montague had to erase the difficult reality of a homeless man and construct a convincing, high-ranking military officer in his place. They gave him a name, Major William Martin. They built a complete life out of paper and props, providing him with a Royal Marines rank, fake identity cards, a fabricated personal history, and even theater tickets and a photograph of a fictional fiancée to place in his pockets. To deliver the payload, they attached a worn leather briefcase to his wrist with a chain. Inside sat the forged letters, casually discussing Allied plans to bypass Sicily and invade Greece and Sardinia instead. The strategy relied on burying the massive lie under a mountain of meticulous manufactured details. If the German experts spent all their time verifying the authenticity of theater tickets and waterlogged letters, they might never question the body itself. This elaborate fiction carried incredibly real stakes. When thousands of Allied troops finally waded ashore in Sicily, their survival depended directly on whether the German High Command had swallowed the bait. The sheer scale of the Allied war machine, navies, air forces, and hundreds of thousands of infantrymen ultimately rested on the lonely, anonymous death of a single individual in a London hospital. It is an uncomfortable reality of the operation. Glyndwr Michael never agreed to be part of the war. He died completely unaware of the vital role his body would play in protecting vulnerable troops on a beach hundreds of miles away. The Allies successfully breached the fortress of Europe with minimal casualties, largely because they took a man society had entirely ignored and turned him into the most convincing liar of the war. Think about what's in your pocket right now. Maybe a set of keys, a crumpled receipt from earlier today, or a loose coin. These unplanned, sloppy fragments of a routine tell a story. Because they are accidental, they provide a footprint of a life that feels authentic and spontaneous. Back in World War II, two intelligence officers named Charles Cholmondeley and Ewan Montague understood this. They worked deep inside the bureaucratic maze of London, facing a problem that required more than standard paperwork. They possessed a dead body and a chosen identity, Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. A lone name offers very little depth. A trained enemy officer finding a body with nothing but a pristine, perfect military ID would suspect a trap. Real identities are defined by their clutter. Cholmondeley and Montague had to design a life defined by its inconsistencies and messy human details. They had to build a person out of thin air. They started with the foundational layers. Standard military identification cards showing his rank and photo. They folded official letters from his commanding officer until the paper looked worn from weeks of being carried in a pocket. Then they added the friction of real life. They drafted a letter from a London bank, an overdraft notice demanding he pay back money he owed. Forgers usually try to create a perfect hero. A man struggling with his bank balance feels ordinary, flawed, and therefore believable. They included ticket stubs from a London theater, the kind of debris you forget to clear out of your jacket. This placed the Major in the heart of the city, living a normal life just days before his death. They layered in more personal tension, a letter from his father, written with a cold, formal tone, and a minor medical note from a doctor about a routine health matter. These unheroic, slightly negative details acted as a shield. When an intelligence analyst finds a man dealing with debt and family friction, they find a person they recognize from their own world, making them less likely to search for a hidden hand behind the documents. Despite these layers, the identity still needed an emotional center. To give the life a heartbeat, the spies invented a fiancée named Pam. They used a real, unposed snapshot of a young intelligence worker named Jean Leslie. In the photo, she looks relaxed and warm, a private image of a woman who loved someone. Along with the photo went a series of love letters. They were tender and private, filled with plans for the life they would build together once the war was over. These letters were designed to trigger a specific response. Reading them makes the viewer feel like they are trespassing on something deeply personal. This engineered sense of intrusion makes the letters feel like an accidental discovery. By making the reader feel like a voyeur, the spies encouraged the enemy to internalize the information as a private truth rather than a staged performance. The trap was set. Major William Martin was now a man with a face, a family, a woman who loved him, and a series of very human worries. With the man fully realized, they attached the payload. A locked briefcase was secured by leather straps and a padlock pulled tight around his wrist. Inside the briefcase were fabricated letters between senior Allied commanders. They discussed massive invasion plans, pointing away from Sicily and toward an entirely different target. If the enemy accepted the man, they would accept the letters. That single leap of faith had the power to divert entire armies and change the course of the invasion. Major Martin demonstrates that the most effective deceptions succeed by mimicking human imperfection. We are conditioned to believe in the messy, the mundane, and the flawed. Major William Martin's identity was locked down to the smallest detail. He had love letters in his pocket, official papers in his jacket, and a leather briefcase secured to his wrist with a thick metal chain. Back in London, a team of intelligence officers had spent months carefully scripting every element of this fictional officer's life. They checked and rechecked every single piece of paper to ensure it held up to scrutiny. But creating the lie was only half the job. Getting it into enemy hands presented a massive psychological hurdle. If you simply walk up to a German officer and hand him a briefcase full of top-secret documents, he is going to assume it is a trap. If you find a briefcase in the sand, you feel lucky. That feeling of discovery, of stumbling onto something you were never supposed to see, tends to push aside the instinct to ask why it's there in the first place. To trigger that reaction, the British decided to simulate a fatal, chaotic disaster. Major Martin had to look like a courier whose flight went down over the ocean, leaving him to simply wash ashore. This created a bizarre operational paradox. To convince the Germans that this perfectly crafted identity was real, the spy masters had to take their masterpiece and intentionally throw away their ability to protect it. The open ocean is entirely too vast for a random drop. Finding the right release point required passing the map through a strict set of political and mathematical filters. First, the body absolutely could not wash up on territory controlled by Britain or the United States. It had to land in a neutral nation. Second, that neutral nation needed to harbor an active underground network of German spies. Planners filtered out the Allied zones and highlighted Spain. While Spain, under General Franco, was officially stayman of the war, local authorities in certain regions maintained highly friendly, collaborative relationships with Nazi intelligence. But dropping a body randomly along the Spanish coast was still too broad of a gamble. The target had to be narrowed down to a specific, compromised local jurisdiction. The intelligence map zoomed in on the coastal town of Huelva. British operatives knew exactly who operated there, a highly active, well-connected German agent who would eagerly pass any found documents up the chain of command. With the political destination locked, they faced an oceanographic constraint. The British couldn't physically place the body on the beach. They had to rely on the ocean's natural physics to do the heavy lifting. Looking at the localized tide data, the current vectors off the coast of Huelva reliably pushed water directly toward the shoreline, rather than sweeping it back out to sea. The final physical constraint dictated the delivery method. The vessel carrying the body had to get close enough to the beach for those currents to catch the cargo, but stay far enough out in the dark to remain completely undetected. By aligning these exact geographic boundaries, political alliances, and tidal flows, the British calibrated a quiet Spanish beach to serve as an exact delivery mechanism for their deception. Now they had the exact coordinates. The next hurdle was moving the fragile cargo across the ocean to that specific drop point without raising any alarms. The job fell to a British submarine, HMS Seraph, and its highly trusted crew. The mission operated under absolute compartmentalization. The sailors were handed a set of coordinates and direct orders to sail for the Spanish coast, but they were kept completely in the dark regarding what they were actually transporting. Down in the submarine's hull sat a massive, sealed metal canister. Packed carefully inside on dry ice was a human body, shielded from any physical damage that might ruin the forensic illusion of a plane crash. The men tasked with delivering the payload that would decide the fate of the Mediterranean were reduced to blind couriers, sailing a sealed metal tube through the Atlantic with no idea what sat inside it. On the pitch-black night of April 30th, 1943, HMS Seraph surfaced quietly off the coast of Huelva. Up on the deck, surrounded by the calm ocean, the crew worked in absolute silence to unseal the heavy metal canister. Before the body left the deck, the officers paused. They gathered around the container and held a brief, makeshift funeral for the man they had built out of paper and props, giving a final service to an officer who had only ever existed in their files. They moved to the edge of the hull and gently slipped Major Martin's body into the cold, churning water. The crew immediately retreated below deck. HMS Seraph submerged and vanished, leaving the body drifting completely alone in the darkness. For British intelligence, this was the terrifying climax of the operation. From the exact moment that body hit the water, their ability to adjust the plan, protect the documents, or intervene if something went wrong instantly vanished. They had done everything possible to control the fiction on land. Now, the success of the entire operation rested entirely in the unpredictable and uncontrollable currents of the vast ocean. The body was in the water, the submarine was gone, and somewhere on the dark Spanish coast, the current was doing its quiet work. Now, the plan was out of British hands entirely. Everything depended on what happened next, and nobody in London could control any of it. Back in London, the intelligence officers who orchestrated the drop, men like Charles Tomendelli and Ewan Montague, could now only wait. They couldn't guide the body or influence the locals. The success of the trap relied on a chain of complete strangers finding the body and acting exactly as the British had hypothesized. Success depended on passing forensic tests, strict bureaucratic inspections, and observant local officials who could collapse the entire narrative. If any one of these uncontrollable events failed, Britain's true invasion strategy was doomed before it ever reached Berlin. On the morning of April 30, 1943, near a stretch of coast near Huelva, Spain, the plan met its first moment of human contact. A fisherman named José Antonio Rey Maria spotted a body face down in the surf. It wore a British military uniform with a briefcase chained securely to the wrist. He pulled the body ashore and reported it. Within hours, the man who had never really lived was in the custody of Spanish authorities. As the remains moved into official hands, the operation faced its most dangerous physical interrogation, the autopsy. A thorough examination could reveal that the man did not actually die from drowning. If a doctor looked too closely at the lungs or the state of decomposition, the entire deception would evaporate. The doctor noted signs of fluid consistent with falling into the sea while still alive, exactly the story the body was meant to tell. By surviving official medical scrutiny, the fictional Major Martin cleared his greatest physical obstacle and cemented his fake death in the real world. Now the British faced a logistical paradox. They needed the Germans to read the documents, but it had to happen without a deliberate handover. Adolf Klaus operated in Huelva as a well-connected local contact, using his civilian status to quietly funnel information back to Berlin. When word reached him of the washed-up officer, Klaus leveraged his local relationships to bypass standard protocols and gain access to the briefcase. Working in the shadows, Klaus extracted the documents from their envelope and photographed every page. He then meticulously resealed the envelope, hiding any evidence of the interception before the briefcase was returned to the British. The payload was delivered invisibly, turning a neutral country's bureaucracy into an unwitting courier for a British trap. Eventually, the Spanish authorities officially handed everything back to Britain: the body, the papers, and the personal belongings, all with polite apologies and formal letters. Back in London, British intelligence finally got their hands on the briefcase, searching for any sign that the Germans had taken the bait. At first glance, the seal appeared completely undisturbed. Cholmondeley and Montague had to look very closely. Only then did they find the tiny, almost invisible signs that the seal had been opened and carefully glued back together. They immediately sent a 6-word telegram to confirm the success of the operation: mincemeat swallowed whole. While the anonymous body was buried in a quiet grave in Huelva under a name that wasn't his, the documents it carried were beginning a much longer journey. The localized deception on that quiet beach had traveled all the way up the chain of command. Because this fragile trap survived the Spanish shore, Britain's fabricated invasion plans were now sitting on a desk inside Nazi intelligence, read, studied, and believed by the enemy. By 1943, the German military intelligence apparatus, the Abwehr, functioned as a filter for every scrap of rumor on the continent. It was a bureaucracy built on systematic suspicion, where analysts were trained to assume that every piece of information was a potential trap. Dropping a corpse on a Spanish beach is a matter of logistics. Convincing a paranoid high command to believe what was in its pockets is a matter of psychology. The stakes were immediate and brutal. If the Abwehr noticed a single flaw in the forgery, the upcoming Allied invasion of Sicily would be exposed, leading tens of thousands of troops directly into a slaughter. The Allies were betting the lives of their soldiers on a psychological stress test. They were asking a piece of fabricated paper to outmaneuver a military empire. The test began the moment the photographs of the documents left the hands of a local German agent in Huelva, Spain. They moved rapidly up the chain of command, passed from desk to desk, gathering urgency at every stop. By the time they reached the Abwehr headquarters in Berlin, they were already flagged as highly critical intelligence. Analysts immediately set to work dissecting the letters. These didn't read like stiff, formal military dispatches. They were detailed and specific, written in the slightly casual, confident tone of busy senior officers who never expected their words to be read by the enemy. Forged documents often fail because they are too neat. They try too hard to be careful, and in doing so, they become too perfect. But the items pulled from the dead man's pockets were different. 2 theater tickets, an overdraft notice from a bank, a photograph of a fiancé. This mundane pocket letter felt wonderfully imperfect and authentically messy. The disguise survived logical scrutiny because it accurately mirrored the chaotic reality of human life. Ultimately, the entire operation rested on the judgment of one man, Alexis von Runge, Germany's most respected military intelligence analyst. His job was to tell the high command what was real. He examined every piece of evidence. He weighed the personal correspondence against the physical condition of a corpse found floating in waters that aligned with a known plane crash route. His official assessment moved straight up the chain. The dead man, Major William Martin, was real. The documents were genuine, and the impending Allied invasion was pointing away from Sicily. But historians have debated his actual motives ever since. Von Runge had a documented habit of quietly inflating Allied troop numbers in his reports, making the German position look far worse than it actually was. Years later, he would be executed by the Nazis for his involvement in an assassination plot against Adolf Hitler. Which leaves us with a lingering question. Did this brilliant analyst actually fall for a well-crafted fiction, or did he spot the lie immediately and pass it upward to secretly sabotage the regime? Whatever von Runge's true intentions were, his report reached the peak of the chain. It landed on the desk of Adolf Hitler personally. Hitler studied the conclusions and accepted them. He sent a message to his commanders stating that the intercepted documents were genuine, quoting his exact words, "beyond any doubt." Look at this map of the Mediterranean theater. Based purely on those letters, Hitler ordered massive defensive reorganizations, draining soldiers, tanks, and artillery away from Sicily. These reinforcements poured into Greece and Sardinia, leaving the true Allied target, Sicily, deeply exposed. The entire European battlefield shifted, moving heavy divisions and tons of steel across the continent, all before the Allies had even fired a single shot. A homeless man from Wales, who had been dead for weeks, armed with a locked briefcase and a well-told story, had outranked every general in the German army. On the night of July 9, 1943, one of the largest invasion fleets ever assembled moved through the Mediterranean Sea toward Sicily. Hundreds of ships were carrying over 160,000 soldiers from Britain, the United States, and Canada. The men on those ships and planes were bracing for the worst. They expected to step off landing craft and into a heavily fortified meat grinder. What they didn't know was that their survival was tethered to a dead man with a briefcase. They were unaware of the forged love letters or the homeless man from Wales whose body had washed up on a Spanish beach 4 months earlier. How did an operation this massive, the largest amphibious invasion in history to that point, come to rely so heavily on something as quiet as a single silent lie? When Allied troops finally hit the beaches, they found defenses that were thin, confused, and in many places completely unprepared. Resistance crumbled faster than even the most optimistic planners had projected. In Berlin, the reason for this collapse was clear. For weeks, German commanders in Sicily had been begging for reinforcements, but their messages were largely ignored. Hitler believed the Sicily invasion was a fake, a distraction designed to pull his attention away from the real target. Because Hitler believed the letters found on the dead man, he gave the order to move. Tanks, soldiers, and guns were pulled away from Sicily and sent to Greece and Sardinia. The German forces spent the summer watching coastlines that stayed quiet, waiting for an attack that never came. The Allies secured their foothold because the divisions and tank units that should have been defending those beaches were simply in the wrong place. Sicily was not easy. There was still real fighting and real casualties. The Germans who were on the island fought hard. But we have to consider what would have happened if Hitler's reinforced tank divisions had stayed. The invasion would have been longer, harder, and far more violent. Military historians conclude that by drawing those forces away, the deception saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. This lack of resistance allowed the island to fall in just 38 days, one of the fastest campaigns of the entire war. That speed triggered a collapse in Rome. Within weeks of the island's fall, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was removed from power by his own government. As Italy began moving towards surrender, the entire shape of the war in Europe started to shift. This shift meant thousands of young men who stepped off those landing craft made it through the day. They made it home, grew old, and raised families. Thousands of men walked off those beaches alive because one man had already walked into the sea dead. In the summer of 1945, thousands of Allied soldiers came home, who otherwise would have died on the beaches of Sicily. The invasion was a total, historic success. That victory was secured because Adolf Hitler and the German High Command had swallowed a massive, elaborate lie. Believing a fake intelligence leak, they moved their defensive armies completely out of the way. But the one person most responsible for that deception, the man whose singular sacrifice made the invasion possible, never heard the news of the victory. Instead, the architects of the plot quietly packed up their desks. Ewan Montagu returned to practicing law. Charles Cholmondeley slipped back into the shadows of British intelligence. The Spanish fishermen who pulled the crucial evidence from the sea went back to their nets. The German agents who processed the documents moved on, completely unaware of the broader picture. Back in London, the British government immediately classified the operation. The files were locked away in deep storage inside the intelligence archives. Officially, the most successful military deception in history simply ceased to exist. The leaders who engineered the victory chose to create a historical vacuum. They buried their own triumph because celebrating it meant acknowledging the deeply controversial operative at the center of the plot. That silence held for 10 years. Then, in 1953, Ewan Montagu was permitted to publish an authorized, highly sanitized account of the operation. He introduced the public to the mechanical trickery: a dead body dropped into the Atlantic, a locked briefcase chained to its wrist, and a pocket full of meticulously forged letters. Readers were astonished. A sprawling, powerful military apparatus had been dismantled by a strange, low-tech ruse. But Montague's best-selling book, and the hit film that followed, omitted a massive detail. They left out the dead man's real name. The intelligence officers involved felt the specific truth of where they found their body was far too uncomfortable to share with a celebrating public. British intelligence wanted the applause for their brilliant spycraft. They did not want to admit the moral trespass required to acquire their human prop. It took another 50 years to breach that secrecy. In 1996, historian Roger Morgan gained access to the unredacted files. There, buried in the paperwork, was the identity of the man in the water, Glyndŵr Ruggall. Michael was a Welshman who lived on the streets of London. He died utterly alone in a hospital from ingesting rat poison, forgotten by society. He lived a completely invisible life, and then his unclaimed body was drafted into military service without his knowledge and certainly without his consent. To buy the salvation of thousands of Allied soldiers, the state exploited a marginalized citizen who had already fallen completely through the cracks of the society he supposedly saved. Glyndŵr Michael held no rank. He never put on a uniform of his own free will, and he never fired a single weapon. Despite lacking every traditional marker of a soldier, he executed the most important deception of the Second World War with absolute perfection. He never panicked under pressure. He never made a mistake on the field. He gave nothing away under scrutiny, simply because he was already gone. The intense poverty and isolation that made Michael invisible while he was alive is exactly what made him an untraceable, flawless weapon in death. In a quiet cemetery in Huelva, Spain, there is a grave that sat for decades under the borrowed name of Major William Martin. Following the 1996 revelation, that stone was updated. It now bears Glyndŵr Michael's real name, alongside a quiet, belated acknowledgement of his service to the country. If you trace the collapse of fascist dictatorships and the liberation of a continent back to their roots, the lines lead right here, to this patch of dirt in the Spanish sun. An entirely ordinary man gave everything he had to become a hero he never agreed to be. He won a war he never even knew he fought.